The village of Ndalani lay between two rivers, cradled by forests whose trees seemed older than time itself. The sun rose each morning over mud-walled huts and thatched roofs, casting golden light on red earth that had been stamped by generations of bare feet. Every morning, smoke curled upward from cooking fires, and the smell of millet porridge, roasted maize, and palm oil mingled with the crisp air. It was a place where life was governed not just by the elders who sat in the council hut, but also by unseen forces, the ancestors whose voices were said to speak through the steady heartbeat of the sacred drums. Those drums, carved from sacred Irako wood and stretched with animal hide, were more than instruments. They were memory, justice, and warning. When they thundered, the village listened. For in Ndalani the drums never lied. Among the villagers lived a girl named Amara, whose very presence seemed to stir whispers wherever she walked. She was slender, her skin glistening like polished mahogany under the sun, her eyes large and dark, carrying a depth that unsettled those who dared to look too long. Children followed her with cruel giggles, whispering names like the Cursed One, while mothers pulled their little ones close, muttering that misfortune lingered wherever Amara went. She had grown used to walking with her head bowed, her woven basket pressed against her side, moving quickly from the river where she fetched water to the small hut she shared with her mother. Though she was no different in flesh and blood, the stories that clung to her shadow made her an outcast. They said her birth was unnatural. Some swore they had seen the moon darken the night she was delivered. Others said the owls circled her hut and refused to leave until dawn. The midwives, tight-lipped and weary, never spoke openly of what they had witnessed, but silence only deepened suspicion. Over the years the tale grew. Amara was born under a curse, marked by spirits, destined to bring misfortune upon anyone who accepted her. And so, she grew up in isolation, her laughter muffled, her questions unanswered, her every movement weighed down by the unseen burden others had fastened on her. Yet despite the cruelty, Amara carried herself with a quiet dignity. At the river, while others jeered, she sang softly to herself, her voice carrying over the rippling current. In the fields, when she worked the soil alongside other women, she endured their pointed whispers without raising her gaze. At the evening fire, when stories were told and laughter filled the night air, she sat on the edges of the crowd, her eyes reflecting both longing and a strange knowing, as if she carried a secret even she did not understand. But beneath the surface of village life, unease brewed. The people of Ndalani had long relied on their customs to protect them from chaos. Every dispute, every question of truth, every matter of honor eventually came before the council of elders. And when words were not enough, when lies tangled themselves too deeply into human mouths, the drums were summoned. Their sound carried across the village square, through the forest paths, echoing against the hills. The elders said the ancestors spoke through them, stripping away deception, demanding justice, revealing what the living dared not speak. Amara's life seemed bound toward that fateful place. Though still young, she could feel the eyes of the village upon her, searching for a reason to bring her before the council hut. Whispers followed her like shadows. She must answer for her curse. The ancestors cannot tolerate her presence forever. What if she brings famine or sickness? Some even claimed the sudden death of livestock or a child's fever was tied to her existence. Though she had done nothing, suspicion clung to her name more tightly than her own skin. And so, the village of shadows waited. The elders, stiff in their woven cloaks, murmured among themselves about the day they would be forced to call Amara before them. The younger villagers anticipated it with cruel excitement, already imagining the spectacle. Her mother wept silently at night, praying the drums would never beat her daughter's name. But Amara herself, though she feared the weight of judgment, felt an ember of defiance burning within. Somewhere deep in her chest, beneath years of rejection, was a quiet certainty that the truth was not what the village believed. It was said that when the drums began to speak, they could shake the very ground, tear apart lies, and expose what had been hidden in the deepest shadows. And as dusk fell on Ndalani and the council fire burned low, the people began to sense that the time was near. A trial was coming and the drums would decide. For in this village, secrets could not live forever, and some truths demanded to be heard. Hints emerge of a secret birth or forbidden parentage hidden by elders. ChatGPT said. Amara's childhood unfolded like a shadow stretching across the ground, never quite touching the light. From the moment she could walk, she learned that other children had fathers who lifted them onto their shoulders, who carved them wooden toys, who shielded them from scoldings with laughter and pride. She, however, had none. When curious eyes asked where her father was, her mother would bow her head and murmur, "He is gone," before swiftly changing the subject. But the children, ever quick to echo their parents' whispers, shouted cruel names at her: fatherless, spirit's child, the cursed one. Their voices chased her across the dusty fields and through the narrow paths between huts, stinging sharper than thorns. Her mother did all she could, though the struggle was plain. Each day before the rooster's cry, she rose to fetch water and tend to the fire. She bent her back in the cassava fields, her palms blistering, her spine aching, so that Amara would at least have food in her belly. But the weight of silence pressed heavily on her mother's face. There were questions she would never answer, secrets she would never untangle, no matter how much Amara begged in the quiet of night. When Amara asked, "Mama, who was he? Where did he go? Did he ever see me?" her mother's eyes grew wet and she would only whisper, "Sleep, my child." Some stories are too heavy for young ears. The villagers, however, were not silent. Their tongues spun tales freely, each version darker than the last. Some claimed Amara's father had been a wanderer, a stranger from a distant land who cursed her mother and vanished before dawn. Others insisted he had been a married man of the village, a union so shameful that the elders themselves silenced the truth. The boldest whispers suggested something worse, that he had been a man too important, too sacred for his blood to mix with her mother's. Whatever the tale, they all pointed to one cruel conclusion: Amara was not meant to exist. Despite this, she grew into a child of remarkable resilience. Where others pushed her away from the games at the riverbank, she learned to carve boats from leaves and sail them alone down the stream. Where she was denied a seat near the fire during evening stories, she found her own corner beneath the stars, weaving her own tales from the constellations. While girls her age braided each other's hair and shared secrets, Amara was in the fields, balancing baskets of firewood larger than her frame, her small arms trembling yet refusing to give in. The world seemed determined to make her bend, but she discovered strength in standing upright, even if no one stood beside her. Yet, deep inside, Amara carried a yearning that no hard work could erase, the dream of being seen, truly seen for who she was. Not the cursed child, not the fatherless girl, not the whispered rumor walking among them, but Amara. She longed for a single kind gaze in the crowd, a word of acceptance, a recognition that she belonged to this earth as much as any other. Sometimes she would stand at the edge of the great clearing where the village gathered during festivals, watching the dances, listening to the thunder of the drums. She imagined stepping forward into the circle, her feet striking the dust in rhythm, the crowd cheering her name. For a moment, her heart swelled with hope. But always just as quickly the reality pressed back down, and she remained in the shadows, clutching her basket, unseen. Her mother tried to shield her from the cruelty, though her own shoulders carried the same burden of shame. Together they lived in a hut at the farthest edge of the village, close to the forest, as though distance might soften judgment. But isolation only sharpened suspicion. Children told each other that Amara's home was haunted, that spirits lingered among the trees around her hut. Women whispered that no man dared marry her mother again for fear of inheriting the curse. At times, even the bravest hunters crossed themselves when they passed her path, muttering prayers under their breath. Still, Amara grew, and with her growth came a quiet fire. She could not silence the whispers, but she could outwork them. If others carried 10 bundles of wood, she carried 12. If others wove baskets of reeds, she wove hers tighter, stronger. Her hands became calloused, her back strong, her spirit sharper. The village began to take note, though not with admiration, rather with suspicion. "How can a cursed child have such strength?" they murmured. "Is it human, or is it the spirits that lend her power?" Beneath these whispers, hints of deeper secrets lingered. Now and then an elder's voice would falter when Amara passed. A few times she caught fragments of conversations that hushed the moment her presence was noticed. "It must never be spoken," she once overheard. "If the drums hear, they will tell." Another time she saw her mother standing before the council hut, her face pale, the elders speaking in low tones. When Amara asked, her mother brushed it aside with trembling hands, saying only, "It was nothing, child. Nothing you need to know." But Amara was no longer a little girl. She began to sense that her life was entangled in something larger than the cruelty of gossip. The elders' eyes lingered too long, their silence too heavy. Why had her mother never once spoken her father's name? Why did the villagers' cruelty carry the sharpness of fear, as though punishing her might keep some greater danger at bay? These questions took root in her heart, growing stronger with each passing year, even as her lips remained silent. And so her childhood became a tapestry of toil, loneliness, and questions without answers. But woven into that tapestry was also a thread of resilience, a quiet defiance that whispered within her, One day the truth will be known. One day the shadows will lift. She did not know when or how, but she believed that the ancestors who spoke through the drums would not remain silent forever. For in a village where every lie feared the sound of wood and hide, Amara's very existence was a drum waiting to be struck. It began with whispers, as many storms in Dalani did. First, the women at the river noticed that the sacred beads of the river goddess, tokens woven from cowries and shells, placed on the shrine near the water's edge, were gone. Some said the river spirits themselves had claimed them. Others whispered that someone had stolen them, and such a theft was no small matter. The beads were not mere ornaments. They were offerings to ensure plentiful rains and the fertility of crops. Without them, the village's pact with the unseen world was broken. At first, the elders told the people to remain calm. They promised to make new offerings, to sing prayers beneath the Irako tree where ancestors listened. But unease began to spread like wildfire. That same week, the skies refused to open. The maize stalks, tall and eager only days before, bowed their heads under the unrelenting sun. The cassava leaves turned brittle, the river shrank, and the air thickened with fear. Mothers looked into their cooking pots and found them emptier each night. Then came the fevers. One by one, children began to cough and burn with heat. The healer worked tirelessly, grinding herbs, chanting invocations, but the sickness spread faster than her remedies could chase it away. Panic wrapped itself around the village. The people of Ndalani had always lived with hardships, but when calamity piled upon calamity, they searched for a cause. The ancestors are angry, some cried. The gods have been offended. But offense required an offender, and the people, restless and hungry, began to cast their eyes about. The drums of gossip quickened, and all their rhythms beat toward a single name. Amara was too easy. She had been born beneath a shadow, raised in whispers, marked by strangeness. To the villagers, she was a curse walking among them, and curses demanded sacrifice. Women clutched their beads and spat as she passed, muttering that her presence had invited the sickness. Hunters swore that the spirits had withdrawn the animals from the forest because she had offended them. Even those who had once remained silent began to add their voices, for fear that if they did not accuse her, they too might fall under suspicion. One night, as the moon hung pale above the village, a group of men appeared at Amara's hut. Their faces were grim, their torches blazing. Her mother tried to bar the doorway, her frail arms outstretched, but the men pushed past her, their words sharp and merciless. The council demands her presence. The drums must decide. If she is innocent, let the ancestors speak. If guilty, let her pay the price. Amara stood frozen in the shadows of the hut, her heart pounding so hard she thought the whole village must hear it. She wanted to protest, to shout that she had stolen nothing, cursed no one, harmed no child. But the men's eyes burned with a hunger for blame, and her words felt like feathers against stone. Dragged through the darkened village, she heard the murmurs of neighbors spilling from every doorway. Children clung to their mothers, pointing with wide eyes. Men spat on the ground as she passed. Women whispered prayers, thanking the spirits that their children had been spared such a fate. Each step toward the council hut was a step deeper into shame, yet within her, a strange calm began to stir. Perhaps it was because she had long known this day would come. Perhaps it was because something inside her whispered that the drums would not beat forever in favor of lies. The council hut loomed ahead, its carved wooden pillars painted with faces of ancestors, each one grim and watchful. A great fire burned in the clearing, casting flickering shadows across the crowd that had gathered. The elders sat in a semicircle, their cloaks heavy with beads and feathers, their faces lined with years of power. At their feet rested the sacred drums, silent for now, their surfaces gleaming in the firelight as though waiting. Her mother stumbled behind, sobbing, her cries swallowed by the hum of the crowd. Amara was forced to kneel before the elders, her knees pressing into the hard earth, her wrists bound with woven rope. She lifted her eyes once, meeting the gaze of the chief elder, a man whose silence carried more weight than thunder. His eyes did not hold pity. They held something colder, fear perhaps, or knowledge unspoken. The village suffers, the elder intoned, his voice carrying over the crowd. Our fields wither, our children burn with fever, our offerings have been stolen from the river shrine. Such calamities do not fall without cause. And when a shadow walks among us, the ancestors demand that we look to it. His hand lifted, pointing directly at Amara. You, child of unanswered questions, stand accused. A roar of agreement swelled from the crowd. Fingers pointed, voices cried out, each one eager to confirm what had been whispered for years. Amara felt the weight of their hatred pressing on her skin, heavier than the ropes that bound her. She wanted to scream, to demand justice, but her throat closed, her words trapped inside. Only her eyes spoke, wide and dark, filled with defiance even as her body trembled. The council prepared to pass its judgment, to let the drums speak, to decide whether she was cursed or chosen for sacrifice. In that moment, as the flames crackled and the drums glistened in silence, Amara understood that she stood on the edge of something vast, a truth buried deep, a secret bound tightly, waiting for release. And though the village longed to see her destroyed, something inside her whispered again, the drums would not lie. The council hut blazed with firelight, its shadows stretching long and jagged across the square. Villagers pressed shoulder to shoulder around the clearing, their faces lit by flickering flames, their eyes gleaming with a hunger for spectacle. The air was thick with dust, sweat, and the smell of burning palm oil. At the heart of it all stood the circle of elders, robed in deep earth tones, their cloaks heavy with cowrie shells and talismans, their heads crowned with carved wooden masks. Each mask bore the stern features of ancestors: wide eyes, flared nostrils, lips sealed in eternal judgment. Behind them, the great council staff leaned against the carved wall of the hut, a symbol that no decision made here could be undone. Amara was shoved forward until she collapsed onto her knees in the dirt. The rope around her wrists bit into her skin, her palms slick with sweat. She kept her head bowed, partly from exhaustion, partly because the weight of dozens of eyes pressing down on her made it almost impossible to lift her chin. Her mother cried from the crowd, her voice breaking, "She is innocent. She is just a child." But her pleas were drowned by the louder roar of villagers demanding justice. "She is the curse among us," a man shouted, his voice cracking like a whip. "The fields died when she grew older," cried a woman, waving her arms wildly. "The spirits warned us and we ignored them." "Banish her," a third voice thundered. "Send her into the forest where she belongs. Let the spirits keep their child." The chants grew louder, overlapping, a storm of rage and fear swirling around the small figure kneeling in the dirt. Children clung to their mothers, wide-eyed, watching the drama unfold. Young men shouted with clenched fists, their faces twisted with the thrill of condemnation. Even the elders, usually calm and deliberate, shifted uneasily in their seats, as though the people's anger was a flood they could not hold back much longer. The chief elder finally raised his staff, and the clamor subsided into tense silence. His voice, deep and steady, rolled out across the clearing. "We are gathered because our village suffers. The river goddess has been dishonored, the rains have fled, and the fevers spread through our homes. When misfortune comes, the ancestors demand answers. And before us kneels the one who has carried the shadow since birth." His eyes, visible beneath the carved mask, locked on Amara. "Child, you are accused of inviting the wrath of the unseen. Speak if you can in your defense." Amara's throat burned. She wanted to speak, to cry out that she had stolen nothing, cursed no one, harmed no child. But as she opened her mouth, the crowd erupted again, their voices drowning hers before the words could even form. "Lies?" someone shouted. "She twists words like a serpent." Others spat on the ground, their hatred striking her harder than stones. The chief elder lifted his hand again, commanding silence. His gaze remained fixed on her, his voice low but laced with finality. "If the people demand punishment, it is our duty to deliver it. Perhaps the ancestors will grant us mercy if the curse is removed." He turned to the other elders, their masked faces grave, and prepared to speak the words that would seal her fate. Amara's chest tightened. This was the moment she had feared since childhood, the nightmare that had followed her every step. Her knees ached against the hard ground, her wrists throbbed in their bonds, but it was the humiliation that burned deepest, the knowledge that she was about to be condemned for crimes she had not committed, judged not for her actions but for her very existence. Then, just as the chief elder raised his staff to deliver judgment, the air shifted. A sound cut through the tension, soft at first, like the distant echo of thunder. It grew steadily louder, a rhythm both strange and familiar, until every ear in the clearing turned toward its source. The villagers stirred, their murmurs rippling like wind through tall grass. The sound came from the edge of the gathering where a group of drummers approached, their bodies draped in animal hides, their faces marked with sacred white paint. Each man carried a drum carved from Irako wood, its surface gleaming in the firelight. The drummers moved in unison, their steps slow, deliberate, as though guided by something greater than themselves. The crowd parted before them, hushed now, the earlier chants dying on trembling lips. Even the elders stiffened, their masks seeming to grow heavier as the rhythm grew stronger. The drums were not invited lightly, they were the voice of the ancestors, called only when human judgment faltered. Their presence meant that this trial was no longer in mortal hands. Amara raised her head, her eyes wide, as the first of the drummers set his instrument down at the center of the circle. The steady beat reverberated through her chest, each strike like a heartbeat too large for her body. The villagers leaned forward, watching with awe and fear, as the sacred rhythm began to weave its spell. The chief elder's staff trembled in his hand. He had not summoned the drummers, no one had. Yet here they were, as if answering to a summons older than memory. He lowered his staff slowly, his voice heavy as he declared, "The ancestors have come to speak. We must listen." The fire crackled, shadows danced, and the drums spoke louder, filling the clearing with a rhythm that silenced all human voices. Amara's humiliation faded into something else, something larger. The moment of her judgment had arrived, but not in the way the villagers had expected. The first strike of the drum echoed like thunder against the earth, a sound so deep it seemed to crawl into the bones of every listener. The second strike followed, then a third, until the rhythm grew steady, a heartbeat larger than the village itself. The drummers, eyes rolled upward in trance, moved their hands with fluid certainty, as though the ancestors themselves guided their fingers. At first, the beat was familiar, the rhythm of judgment long used in council gatherings. But then it shifted. A strange urgency entered the sound, a quickening that no one had heard before. The villagers stirred uneasily, glancing at one another. Even the elders, men who had sat through countless ceremonies, straightened in their seats, their masks turning stiffly toward the drummers. Amara lifted her head. For the first time since being dragged before the council, she did not bow. The rhythm was calling to her, pressing against her chest, forcing her to breathe in time with its pulse. Her dark eyes glistened in the firelight, and though her body trembled, her neck straightened, her shoulders squared. The villagers gasped softly, murmuring to one another. Why does she raise her head? Why does she look at the drums? Some crossed themselves for protection, fearing what it meant. The drums grew louder, the sound swelling like a tide that could not be held back. Each beat reverberated in the air until it felt as if the earth itself was vibrating. Then came the strange part. Within the pounding rhythm, words began to form. Not spoken by human mouths, but heard in the mind, carried on the vibration of hide and wood. The villagers froze, straining to understand. "She is not cursed," the rhythm seemed to say. The crowd shifted restlessly, their fear mixing with confusion. "She carries truth." The silence of the people deepened until the only sound was the relentless drumming. Faces that had burned with hatred moments before now softened into bewilderment. Mothers pulled their children closer, unsure whether to protect them or push them forward to witness history. The chief elder gripped his staff tightly, his knuckles white beneath the wood, but he did not speak. For even he, proud and unshaken, could not deny what he heard. The rhythm shifted again, faster now, as though unearthing memories long buried. The firelight flickered wildly, and in its dance, the people began to see things. Visions rising unbidden in their minds, like stories forced into being. They saw the night of Amara's birth. The moon was full, then swallowed by a sudden cloud, casting the village into darkness. They saw her mother, younger, lying in the small hut at the edge of the forest, her cries of labor filling the night. At her side was a man, strong and proud, his face partially hidden by shadow, but his bearing unmistakable. He was no stranger. He was no outcast. He was one of their own, a man of power, a man whose bloodline was forbidden to mix with hers. Gasps escaped from the crowd as the truth unraveled in the rhythm. "No, it cannot be," someone whispered. It was him. Others shook their heads violently as if to deny what they had seen, but the drums beat harder, demanding acknowledgement. The vision grew sharper. They saw the man clasp the newborn child in his arms, saw the elders arrive, their faces pale with shock and fear. They heard the hurried whispers, "This must not be spoken, the council will decide, she must live but hidden." They saw the beads of the river goddess being offered not to the shrine, but to seal the secret of her existence. And then the image faded, swallowed by the relentless rhythm. Amara's chest rose and fell as though the air itself was heavy with revelation. She understood little of what the drums showed, yet she knew instinctively that they had spoken of her father, of the truth her mother had never dared utter. She felt both fury and sorrow, the weight of a lifetime's rejection shifting suddenly into something larger, a destiny she had not chosen but could no longer deny. The villagers, meanwhile, trembled in the firelight. Those who had mocked her now lowered their eyes, ashamed, afraid of the ancestors' wrath for their cruelty. Some wept openly, realizing they had condemned an innocent. Others muttered prayers for forgiveness, bowing their heads to the drums as though to plead with the unseen spirits. The elders themselves sat rigid, their masks suddenly heavy, their authority unraveling before the sound that spoke a truth greater than their power. The drums did not relent. They struck faster, louder, until the very ground seemed to shiver beneath them. Each beat was a command, each rhythm a revelation. Her blood is of the high line, the drums declared. Her birth was hidden, her life denied, injustice done. The words rang clear, undeniable. Amara's head lifted higher, her eyes no longer filled with fear but with fire. For the first time she saw herself not as the cursed one, but as the vessel of truth the ancestors had chosen to reveal. The crowd could not look away. The rhythm had bound them all in its grip, leaving no room for lies or denial. They saw her for what she truly was, not a child of curse but a child of destiny. The vision of her birth lingered in their minds, impossible to erase. And when at last the drums began to slow, their final beats echoing like the last words of an ancient story, the clearing remained utterly silent. Amara stood taller on her knees, her wrists still bound but her spirit unbroken. She looked out over the faces of those who had mocked her, who had dragged her here to be judged, and she saw their shame reflected in the firelight. The truth had been spoken, not by her lips, not by her mother's trembling words, but by the ancestors themselves. And truth, once spoken by the drums, could not be buried again. The final echoes of the drums lingered in the night air, rolling through the village like the voice of thunder after a storm. Then, as if the spirits themselves demanded it, the drummers began to chant. Their voices were deep, resonant, layered one over the other like waves crashing upon the shore. Each syllable carried weight, each word trembled with authority. They chanted her name, but not as the villagers had ever heard it. They added to it a title, a lineage, a bloodline that until this moment had been wrapped in silence. She is the daughter of the chief's line, the voices rang out, born of blood meant to lead, hidden by fear, silenced by men who sought control. The villagers gasped as one, the truth striking them harder than any blow. Whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. The chief's daughter? How could it be? Why was this never spoken? Mothers clutched their children tighter. Men who had once spat at her name now covered their mouths, unable to look upon her with the same eyes. Amara's mother, who had stood trembling at the edges of the crowd, fell to her knees. Her body shook as though the truth had pierced her more deeply than any spear. Tears streamed down her face, glittering in the firelight. For years she had carried this secret, locking it away behind silence, fearing the wrath of the elders and the shame of the people. But now, with the ancestors themselves speaking through drum and chant, there was no more hiding. "My daughter," she cried out, her voice broken and raw, "forgive me. I carried this weight because I feared for your life. They told me to bury the truth, to let you live in shadows rather than see you destroyed by their hands. You were never cursed. You were never less. You are the blood of greatness, but they forced me to raise you as though you were nothing." Her sobs rose above the murmurs, and even the hardest-hearted among the crowd felt their eyes sting with shame. The villagers bowed their heads, unable to meet Amara's gaze. Men who had mocked her at the riverbank, who had laughed at her torn clothes and whispered of her being cursed, now pressed their foreheads to the ground. Women who had forbidden their children to play with her now wept openly, clutching their own little ones as if to shield them from their guilt. The shame was collective and it was heavy. The truth had exposed them all. Amara stood silent, her eyes fixed on her mother, her heart pounding. Rage, sorrow, and relief battled within her, each one threatening to consume her. She wanted to weep for the years stolen from her, for the cruel names, the hunger, the loneliness. But she also saw her mother's face, aged by fear and sacrifice, her tears sincere, her love undeniable despite the secrecy. Compassion, though hard, began to push against the anger in her chest. The elders, however, sat rigid, their masks now seeming grotesque and heavy. They could no longer pretend to hold power over the truth. The drummer's chant had exposed them as much as it had revealed her. The people's eyes turned toward them, demanding an explanation. One elder tried to stand, his staff shaking in his hands, but his voice faltered. "This was for the good of the village," he muttered, but the words sounded hollow, brittle, like dry wood snapping under pressure. Another elder dropped his mask entirely, letting it fall into the dust. His old eyes shone with something between sorrow and resignation. "We thought we could silence destiny," he admitted softly. "But the spirits will not be silenced. The truth has spoken. It was not ours to bury." His voice broke, and he too bowed his head before the girl they had condemned. The drums fell silent at last, but their echo remained within every chest, a reminder of what had just occurred. Amara no longer knelt as a prisoner but stood as something greater, not by her own choice, not by any desire for power, but because the truth had pulled her out of the shadows. The villagers shifted, then their voices rising in a new rhythm. Where once they had cursed her, now they murmured her name with reverence. Amara, Amara, Amara. It was hesitant at first, fragile like a newborn's cry, but it grew stronger with each breath until the chant filled the night. The same voices that had condemned her now lifted her. The elders looked at one another, their authority crumbling. They had thought themselves keepers of truth, but destiny had bypassed them, speaking through drums and visions instead. For the first time, they understood that no council, no decree, no mask of power could silence what the ancestors demanded to be revealed. Amara's mother crawled forward on her knees until she was before her daughter. She reached up with trembling hands to touch the hem of Amara's garment, as though seeking forgiveness not only as a mother but as a servant of truth. Amara's tears finally broke free, falling hot onto her cheeks, and she bent to lift her mother up. "You hid it because you feared," she whispered softly, "but now the drums have spoken. Fear is over." The fire roared higher, sparks leaping into the sky as if the ancestors themselves celebrated the moment. The truth had come. Destiny had declared itself. And no one, not even the most powerful elder, could deny it any longer. The night air was thick with smoke from the fires, yet it seemed lighter than ever before. Amara rose slowly from where she had stood, her back straight, her chin lifted, her eyes steady. The dust of the earth clung to her skin, but in that moment it looked as though she wore the robe of queens. The silence that followed her movements was reverent, almost fearful, broken only by the crackle of flames and the faint echo of the drum's last beat. Every eye was fixed upon her. She took her first step forward, and the crowd parted as if moved by an invisible hand. Men who once hurled stones at her lowered their heads. Women who had forbidden their daughters to play at her side now extended trembling fingers, desperate to touch her hand. And when their hands met hers, they found not scorn or wrath but a quiet strength that radiated from her like the glow of the rising sun. Voices rose again, her name chanted by the same lips that once whispered curses. Amara. Amara? At first it was clumsy, awkward, as though the villagers had to cleanse their tongues of bitterness before speaking it with pride. But soon the chant grew strong, rolling like a river in flood, uniting the people who had been divided by lies for so long. The air vibrated with their voices, and Amara walked through them as though she had always belonged, as though the ancestors had kept her in waiting for this very hour. Her mother rushed to her side, her face still wet with tears. For a moment the crowd held its breath, unsure of what would come, whether Amara would turn her back on the woman who had hidden her truth. But Amara bent low, lifted her mother up, and embraced her in front of all. "I forgive you," she whispered, loud enough for those near to hear. "You chose fear but you also chose love. And love has brought us here." Her words fell upon the crowd like rain after drought, washing away the last clinging shadows of doubt. One by one villagers dropped to their knees. Even the proudest of elders bowed their heads, their staffs planted in the ground not as weapons of judgment but as symbols of surrender. They had no choice but to accept what had been revealed, and in their submission, a new order began to form. The firelight danced across their faces, erasing the harshness of shame and painting them in a softer glow, the glow of humility, of recognition, of reverence. And then, almost without plan, the festival itself shifted. Where moments before it had been a stage for condemnation, it now became her coronation. Children ran forward, scattering petals of bright blossoms at her feet. Women draped her in cloth dyed in colors of royalty, once reserved for chiefs and priestesses. Men struck their drums again, but not with accusation, with rhythms of triumph and honor. The flames leapt higher, casting her shadow long across the earth, as though marking her as part of the land itself. Amara stood before them all, not as a girl mocked in whispers or burdened by shame, but as a daughter of truth, a living testament that destiny cannot be buried. She lifted her hands, not to command but to bless, and the chanting of her name rose into the heavens. In that moment she was no longer forgotten, no longer cursed. She was the child of honor, the voice of the drums made flesh. And as the festival raged on, the night itself seemed to bow before her rise. No matter how deep lies are buried, the drums of destiny will always find a voice. This is the truth that settled over the village long after the fires had dimmed and the chanting had faded into silence. The people carried it in their hearts like a flame that refused to be extinguished. For years they had mocked her, turned their faces away from her suffering, and clothed themselves in pride while she lived in shadows. Yet in one night, before the council, before the ancestors, and before the unrelenting rhythm of the sacred drums, all of that arrogance was broken. The villagers realized that the power of truth is greater than the schemes of men, and no hand, no decree, no shameful whisper can hold it down forever. Her story became a lesson carved into memory, a living reminder that no one truly knows the weight another carries, nor the destiny waiting in silence. The same lips that once spat curses at her had now learned reverence. The same eyes that had looked upon her with contempt now gazed at her with awe. They had condemned her without cause, mocked her for being different, cast her into the pit of their fear and prejudice. But when the drums spoke, they were forced to bow to what they could not deny. And so the village learned, never mock or condemn another, for the one you despise may hold within them a story greater than you imagine, a destiny that could reshape your world. Children would sit by the firesides and hear her tale retold, and mothers would hush their little ones with the warning, do not laugh at the weak, for the drums are always listening. Elders, who once wore masks of authority, now told the youth with trembling voices, respect every soul, for the blood of kings may run in the veins of a beggar, and the ancestors reveal their secrets only when the time is right. The village began to understand that shame was not in being poor or orphaned or mocked, but in scorning those whom the spirits themselves had chosen. For Amara, the weight of her new place was both a crown and a burden. She walked through the days that followed not as a girl defined by ridicule, but as a symbol of truth's triumph. Yet deep inside she knew her journey had only begun. The drums had spoken of her lineage, of her bloodline, of the greatness that flowed in her veins, but they had not yet spoken of her destiny. A truth revealed is only the first step toward a destiny fulfilled. And she felt it, like the pulse of the earth beneath her feet, that more would be demanded of her than simply surviving humiliation and rising above shame. At night, when the village slept, she sometimes returned to the circle where the judgment had been passed. She would stand in the silence and remember the moment the drums had risen in her defense. The memory filled her with strength, but it also filled her with questions. Why now? Why had the ancestors waited until this very night to reveal the truth? What lay ahead for one chosen by destiny and declared before all as the child of honor? The stars above seemed to shimmer with answers she could not yet hear, and the whispers of the forest carried secrets she longed to understand. The villagers saw her as redeemed, even exalted, but she knew redemption was not the end of her story. It was only the threshold of something greater. And so she carried herself with humility, showing compassion even to those who had wronged her, forgiving with a grace that confounded them all. But her heart remained restless, beating in time with drums only she could hear, drums that spoke not of the past but of the future. And so her tale closes not with an ending but with a promise. A promise that the truth, once freed, never sleeps again. A promise that destiny, once revealed, demands to be fulfilled. The villagers believed they had witnessed her rise, but in truth, they had only witnessed the beginning. For though the drums had silenced the lies of her birth, they now whispered of trials yet to come, of paths she must walk, of a voice she must become for more than just her village. No matter how long lies are carried, the truth will find a drum to speak through. And when it does, no force of man or elder can silence it. The people of the village had seen it with their own eyes, heard it with their own ears, and bowed before it with their own knees. But as for Amara, her journey was still unfolding, her destiny still reaching beyond the horizon. The night of her revelation was not her end. It was her dawn.